I'm Jill Ovens. I'm the National Secretary of the Women's Rights Party, and I'm also co-leader of the party and have been ever since the day Posey Parker came to New Zealand. We turned up and there was no presence of police whatsoever, and I started, and so did lots of other people, where are the police? Where are the police? They started descending, the trans allies, on our little wee crowd, which was inside the barriers. Still no sign of the police, and when Kellie-Jay arrived, that's when the barriers came down. So I had been concerned in the week before Albert Park, when I saw what was happening and how it was reported by the media from Melbourne. And as soon as those neo-Nazis, supposed, did their little performance on the steps of the Victorian Parliament, the media just cottoned on to that, and it all became about the people supporting Kellie-Jay, and Kellie-Jay herself were Nazis, which incensed me because I've always been of the left all my adult life, in fact, going back into high school days. How do they define a Nazi? Because they obviously have no history, because the Nazis hated women, they experimented on women and exterminated women and their children. And it wasn't just Jewish women either, it was communists, artists, academics. So these new Nazis, the neo-Nazis, they're the most misogynist, white supremacist group that you can imagine. So it was, to me, it was a huge slur to call myself and others who I knew were going to be there Nazis. So that's what I was going to speak about. It was so loud, terribly loud. So for a long time afterwards, I couldn't watch the videos because it was just triggering, really triggering to hear the noise. And what was really disturbing was I've also been a trade union leader for 36 years, and there was the flags of my union, the PSA and ETU, both of which I've belonged to, and Unite Union, all in there with the trans allies supporting the drowning out of women, and it was absolutely deliberate by that crowd. I was furious too, because I'd been a long time Labour activist on the Labour Party Council for New Zealand, and locally as well. And there was Michael Wood, Minister of Immigration, saying that he couldn't stop Kellie-Jay Keen coming into the country, but she had vile and incorrect worldview, which I thought was incredibly authoritarian. And then Kiri Allen, who was the Minister of Justice at the time, put out on social media, and I should just read it to you because it's so bad. Let's do what we do, Aotearoa. Stand up, make some noise and support our trans whānau by showing up and drowning out their bigotry. She was the Minister of Justice. And Grant Robertson, who was the Deputy Prime Minister at the time, also put out such provocative statements. And so I just couldn't stay in Labour anymore. And that night I resigned from the Labour Party. We set up our own party, Dawn and I, on the phone all night talking about what we were going to do, because the election was coming up. We couldn't vote for the other side. The Greens were just as bad. Marama Davidson was there, and Chloe Swarbrick and all the rest of them, and they had got media out through social media to all their people to turn up. So a lot of the 2,000 or so counter-protesters were actually Green supporters as well as Labour. Couldn't vote for them. So we were talking, should we just not vote? But we couldn't do that because no one would know we didn't. So we thought, well, let's start our own party, and then at least gives people who are politically homeless somewhere they could vote. And so that's what we did. And within a week, we had a Zoom meeting, which 20 women came on, and they made a decision that we would call it the Women's Rights Party, that we would be independent of other movements overseas, and that we would be a New Zealand Women's Rights Party.
the latest trend.
Vote women's rights.
There's people enlisting, most of them
We have a lot of men as well as women members. I call them the platform guys. About a third of our membership is made up of that. I rang up a man because he hadn't paid his membership fee, so I said to him, I'm just curious to know why you joined the Women's Rights Party. And he said, because I've got an 8-year-old daughter and I don't want that SHIT being taught to her in school. So that's quite a common motivation for men. But they also don't like the idea of men going into their wives' or their daughters' changing rooms, toilets, etc. So yes, it's an appeal to both men and women. So we have a policy platform which covers a lot more than simply issues about toilets and changing rooms and things like that. We talk about pay equity, we talk about women's income, particularly in retirement, or women who are at home with their children. But this year, for our legislative priorities that we would hope to achieve if we got into Parliament, first of all, we want to turn back sex self-ID, because that's at the root of the problems of men thinking that they have the right to access women's spaces, and that includes social media, refuges, and all that sort of thing. And then in a sort of a twin piece of legislation is the conversion practices prohibition legislation, which basically says that you have to, if you're a counsellor or somebody who's a professional, teacher for example as well, you have to affirm a child's preference about gender, and you can't use any other sorts of therapy. And what happens then is that you've got a whole lot of confused adolescents who are probably gay being transed, and particularly with girls there is a very high rate of regret or detransitioning. And unfortunately by that time they've taken testosterone, so their voice has changed, they develop male pattern baldness and all sorts of things. So that's two that we want to turn back. Take out gender identity from the conversion practices legislation and reverse the self-sex ID. Then one thing that we are concerned about is what's happening, particularly with girls, with watching pornography online, and the outcome of that is young people engaging in rough sex. And then in the case of Grace Millane was killed during what was her defence lawyer said was a sex game gone wrong that she had consented to. Now, what we want to do is to ban the use of rough sex as a defence in a murder case. And they did that in the UK because Gillian Millane, who's Grace's mum, went back to the UK and campaigned for that because Grace didn't consent to being murdered. Following on from legislative changes we'd like to make in terms of recording your actual sex on your birth certificate and getting rid of gender out of the conversion practices legislation. We also are really concerned about the Law Commission's report, which recommended sweeping changes in a 500-page document to change the Human Rights Act. They want to include gender identity, non-binary and innate variations of sex characteristics, which they're muddling up as if it's a trans issue, which it isn't. It's a medical issue, and yes, we agree that people who are born with indeterminate sex because of issues with sex development during pregnancy, that they should have access to proper medical treatment. Now, this coalition government has said it's not a priority, and so they've basically put it on a shelf somewhere. It's not that it won't ever be surface again, and if there's a change of government, it will quite likely surface. What it does is in the Human Rights Act, there are 19 exceptions that allow for things like having women's sports category for women only. It allows for women's spaces to be provided in gyms and swimming pools, changing rooms, for example. It allows for a woman to request that the person who's doing her personal, intimate care be a woman. Those exceptions will all be under threat, and there's a number of others as well, if gender identity is put in as a protected ground, because it will undermine the first prohibited form of discrimination in the Human Rights Act, which is sex. And it's very clear that the people who drafted the law in the first place intended that word sex to mean women and men, because it's got in brackets, including pregnancy and childbirth. And of course, a man cannot get pregnant and therefore will not have childbirth. So we want to make sure that those changes don't happen to the Human Rights Act. So another thing that's underway, as well as the Law Commission review that came out earlier this year, is that this government decided that they would ban puberty blockers for the use of, in relation to gender dysphoria of adolescents. It's actually children, because it's too late by the time they get to be adolescents. They've already developed all their sex characteristics. So finally, we think that it's really important to use clear language when you're talking about women's health, for example. And what happened is that there was an instruction to Health New Zealand and the Ministry of Health that they were to use the word women and not birthing people or cervix havers or all the other euphemisms that they try to put in to avoid mentioning the word women. And what happens as a result of this is that it could be really, really serious. So I'll give you an example that in the labs, when they test people's blood for various characteristics, this sample was supposedly from a woman, and it had a marker for prostate cancer. And so the lab thought, oh, we've made a mistake. And they turned the whole lab upside down, looking at all their processes to see if they had made a mistake. And then they went back to the doctor and to the records, and it was a man who identifies as a woman who didn't know that he had prostate cancer markers and would never have known had the lab not been so diligent in trying to track that down. So it can have really serious consequences. So, and we get really upset, all of our members and myself too, when the media refers to criminals who are men, who are identifying as women, who are committing crimes, usually against women, crimes that are serious sexual assault, for example, and they're identified in the newspaper as a woman. And this, we think, will change the statistics. All of a sudden, we're going to have women committing these sexual offences, including murder. So that's what got me into this issue in the first place, because I was working for the Midwives Union, and midwifery seems to be right at the epicentre of the whole resistance by the transgender community. And so what happened is that every time you mentioned the word woman, somebody would say, oh no, you've got to put birthing people, which I refused to do, of course. And so this continued on, and then they came up with changing the midwifery scope of practice. And at first, it never mentioned women, not once, nor babies. Then in the Council of Trade Unions, where I was the Midwives Union representative, we were looking at the strategic plan, and it was a section on equity. And it had equity for Pasifika, for Māori, for people with disabilities, for people of different ethnic groups. So I put up my hand and I said, I think there's a typo here, because it doesn't mention women. And then there was this big silence, and then I noticed while the silence was happening that it said people of different gender identities. And I said, unless you intend to include women as a different gender identity, because we're not. And then there was another silence, and I put it on my Facebook. Isn't this bizarre? And all of my Labour friends, my Green friends, my Union friends started piling on me, saying trans women are women, trans women are women. And I was like, what is a trans woman? Is it a woman who thinks she's a man, or a man who thinks he's a woman? I had no idea about it. And so I said, well, if I identify as Māori, does that make me Māori? Oh no, of course not. You have to whakapapa Māori. So you can't just declare you're Māori, but you can just declare you're a woman. And it was at that point that someone saw me getting the pile on from my was friends, and she put me in touch with someone from Speak Up for Women, and that's when I found out all about what was going on. I had no idea. I'll talk about the issue of strategic voting, because a lot of women, including members of the Women's Rights Party, think that they probably should vote strategically for a party that's in Parliament and that is likely to be able to stop these human rights changes going through and stop the ban on puberty blockers being overturned. And the problem is there is only one possible party that would possibly achieve those goals. None of the rest would, because you have to remember that when self-sex ID went through in 2021, every single MP from the left and the right voted for it, every one of them. So you can't trust any of them. But the other point is that if you vote for one of the other parties, no one knows why you voted for that party. They don't know that your concern is about women's privacy and dignity in women's spaces, for example. But if you vote for the Women's Rights Party, everyone will know, including the politicians in all those other parties, that this is an issue that women deeply care about. And the fact of the matter is that women, particularly older women, vote. And so if you want the women's vote, then you better vote for the Women's Rights Party so that those politicians know that this is an issue that they have to stand firm on. It's often said that the only thing that we're concerned about is trans people. But actually we are a women's rights party, and we're concerned about the implications for the hard-won rights of women. Ever since women first got the vote in New Zealand, which was the first country in the world, we have been fighting for so many rights. First of all, the right to vote, then the right to stand in Parliament, then the right to buy a house without having your husband or your father come and sign the mortgage, the right to pay equity, for example. And what's been happening is that the changes in legislation to accommodate trans people has confused the issue, and we need to have that straightened out. We are a party that stands for women's rights.
So